Welcome to the Water People podcast. I'm Lauren Hill, and my co-host is Dave Rastovich. Today, we're in conversation with Native Hawaiian historian and surfer, Dr. Isaiah Helekunihi Walker. Isaiah is author of Waves of Resistance, which analyzes the history of surfing, resistance, and masculinity in 20th century Hawaii. Isaiah's research creatively analyzes the surf space, where Hawaiian people have continued to be empowered and colonial hierarchies have often been turned upside down.
A little while ago, Cliff Capone sent us the amazing book Waves of Resistance by Isaiah Walker. And this was such a revelation. It was so enlightening for me, mostly because the first time I went to Hawaii was like 1995. I was 14 years old, completely head over heels with the place and the culture and the very little I knew of the culture. But I was aware of the outrigging and the paddleboarding and other aspects of sort of waterman life at that stage. So I just really revered Hawaiian surfing culture. The book is such a great read. It's so insightful, also insightful for the link between people like John Kelly and the Save Our Seas work with environmentalism back in the 70s, being tied in with a real resurgence in Hawaiian cultural practices and language and all these interweaving areas of surfers and those efforts. And then people like Nainoa Thompson and the Hokulea Pacific Voyaging Society group forming all these amazing aspects that we should all know in depth as surfers, but so few of us do.
Isaiah's book is such an interjection of the ways that modern surfing as we know it is absolutely entwined and inseparable from the way the ancient Hawaiians did surfing and crafted a surfing culture. And it was really their sustainable food science, Ahupua'a, that created such a level of affluence and abundance because everyone was so well fed that they had time for leisure, for sport, and for art. And that included surfing. And the difference, we know even from other episodes that we've done on the podcast, we know that there were ancient and old surfing cultures in China, in Peru, and in many other parts of the world. But the difference was that in Polynesia and in Hawaii in particular, surf culture was blossoming. It was vibrant. It was a part of so many aspects of life, from courtship to play to sport. And we really have their culture to thank for surfing as we know it. And the timeless link between surfing and food.
Yeah, totally. It's such an amazing story to share with others, really. It just feels like in order to really have a broad and holistic understanding of what this amazing thing is that we call surfing and a surfing life, is to really look at these details of how it came to be that there were so many people surfing in Hawaii when Europeans first came across the culture, how it was thriving so, and to the center of why we have such reverence for it, why it's so revered, and is still happening now. There are still so many amazing Hawaiian people who have persevered, who have overcome, who are just re-energizing cultural practices, and language is huge. And people like Cliff and people like Isaiah and many others.
One of the narratives that Isaiah really has a problem with is the way that when we talk story about colonialism in Hawaii, we, in surf history spaces anyway, often talk about how surfing disappeared or was extinguished from the Hawaiian Islands through that wave of colonialism. And Isaiah Walker says that is absolutely not true. How could it have disappeared if not long afterward we have Duke Kahanamoku, ambassador of Aloha, literally gifting surfing to California, even though he wasn't the first Hawaiian to go to California, and to Australia. So there has been a rich surfing culture all along, and of course that continues today. But I think we probably don't give enough reverence to the people who, made the art, made the sport, made the culture of surfing possible.
Yeah, well, we don't want to give away too much, I guess, right now, because in the conversation, which we could have continued for a very long time with so many questions and so much enthusiasm from us, to be able to just have a chat with Isaiah, and he was so gracious and, busy man. He's got lots of kids, does lots of teaching. I think he's carrying a lot of weight when it comes to the work he does, cultural work there. And one of the great moments of getting insight into Isaiah's cultural work was when we were last in Hawaii and the backdoor shootout was happening, and he was one of the key commentators who was really speaking a lot of Hawaiian language and speaking to historical practices with surfing there in Hawaii. As Hawaiians and local people there were surfing pipeline on stand-up paddleboards, body surfing, shortboards, just whatever they could, doing it whatever way they wanted at a place and at an arena that has typically been dominated by the corporate and largely Californian or Australian aspects of surfing. And so it was really amazing to see him there and all the other Hawaiian crew there playing in that incredible space, and his language being something so inclusive and celebratory of Hawaiian roots. It's great.
We mentioned big wave surfer and surfboard builder Greg Knoll in this week's episode, which is kind of strange timing because Greg passed away this week at age 84. We just wanted to send love to his family, and we hope the conversation doesn't come across as insensitive in any way, but we chat with Isaiah about the way that Knoll and other Californian surfers were characterized, and not necessarily through their own doing, but they were characterized as, quote, discoverers and, quote, conquerors of big Hawaiian waves. And this narrative has really stuck for quite a long time, but it ignores and continues to ignore the ancient and still living culture where surfing came from in the first place. So we can recognize Greg Knoll as many things, having made many contributions to surf culture, but maybe altering some of the language around his contributions would be the most respectful to Hawaiian people in particular.
Yeah, the story around the early Californians, riding Sunset Beach and Paumalu and Waimea Bay, those places, it was, spoken of in that sort of conquering and dominating type of approach. But that was, like you said, not necessarily from them themselves. It was the storytellers around them and the film mechanisms, the system around of how to tell a story and get bums in seats at the auditorium and all of that. So it's really for the benefit of us all that Isaiah and others, I'm sure, have sort of the more accurate backstory of local Hawaiians surfing those waves at the same time. They just weren't included in those films, and how we can really do much better than that now. And that's something great to aim for. And just such a lovely tone with Isaiah. I personally would probably have a lot of anger issues if I was living in Hawaii and seeing what was happening there with my people and over-tourism and so many other things, and something like surfing being so commodified and somewhere like the North Shore just being completely taken over by those interests. It'd be really frustrating, but he's a very sweet man. Had a very fun conversation with him, while at the same time being very informative, very enlightening for us. And really for me, I read that book and I just wished it was on the back of every aeroplane and in every boat that gets to Hawaii, and everyone who gets there should be reading it before they paddle out anywhere.
On every surfer's bookshelf, this one.
It really needs to be. So hopefully that can, start happening a little more, and a conversation like this could steer people towards his amazing work and the retelling of Hawaiian surfing stories from Hawaiian people.
I'd love to begin where we begin all of our water people conversations, and that's with a story. Would you mind sharing with us about a time or experience after which you were never the same?
Wow. Yeah. I'll be honest. I've been, when I started looking at you guys' podcast, and, that's the question. It's been sort of haunting me, like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? And I'd have to say that it's more like when I was 16, my world was turned upside down in real dramatic ways that really shaped my life in different directions. It even contributed to where I am at today. So when I was like 16 years old, I was really into amateur competitive surfing in Hawaii. So, ever since I was young, I surfed a lot. My grandmother actually grew up surfing in Waikiki with the Kahanamoku brothers. And so it's just sort of been part of our experience. But yeah, so when I was 16, it seemed like my trajectory was to try and go for to be a pro surfer. Now, this was in the 1990 or even 89 or something like that. So it was a little different scene back then, but I grew up with that momentum generation. So I'm from the Big Island of Hawaii. And so guys like Shane Dorian and Conan Hayes, who are from Kona, that was my generation. I was actually in between those two guys in their age. So when I was 16, I was sort of on that path. I had sponsors. It's funny because my kids, they laugh at me now. They're like, what is Instinct? I was like, I was sponsored by Instinct. They were a good clothing brand. Anyway, they don't even know what that is. But, and then, had surfboard sponsors, and I was, but being from the Big Island, especially at that time period, it's different from what it is today. But nonetheless, I was sort of on that trajectory. And so surfing, was kind of my life. So I was ranked first on the Big Island in my age group. And then I went on to surf in the state competition and made the finals and did pretty well. And then went on into the US championships, which now they call the Surfing America. And so that was, and I ended up making the finals and getting 5th place. But I probably wouldn't have been a great pro surfer. Maybe wouldn't even lasted very long at all, to be honest. But that was where my heart was and sort of my motive. And then at 16, my life turned upside down. So my father, he passed away of a heart attack, but it was a pretty interesting evening. It was Father's Day. We had just gone out to dinner. My older sisters were off in college, so it was just me, my dad, and my stepmom who lived together. And my stepmom wakes me up in the middle of the night when I'm sleeping, and she's frantic, saying, "Your dad's on the floor downstairs, and I don't think he's breathing." So I run downstairs, and instinctively, probably as a surfer and had taken CPR classes and junior lifeguard type of training, I found myself performing CPR on my dad on our kitchen floor at 16 years old. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And I was forced to reevaluate my perspective on life. I'd never stopped surfing, but my life sort of took me into a different direction, one that involved more kind of spiritual and religious pursuits. So my parents were divorced, but my mom's side of the family, which is our Hawaiian side of the family, has this interesting Mormon lineage. So my great grandfather was one of these first early converts as a Hawaiian to the LDS church, the Mormon church. And so my mom was always pretty, religious in that route, but I wasn't, because I was raised with my dad and I wasn't really interested in pursuing that. But my grandfather, grandfather's name was Manuel Helekunihi, and he always sort of had this vision of me that I'd be doing other things that kind of were with that side of my family's route. I didn't really see it happening, but as my world turned upside down, I did end up joining this faith of the Latter-day Saints, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and ended up just kind of doing different kinds of pursuits. For example, I ended up actually quit surfing for 2 years and I went on this Mormon mission, with the white shirts and the ties and riding a bike. And in my mind, though, I always felt like the Lord sort of knew where my heart was. And what ended up happening was I had come back after this experience of serving a mission. I came back to Hawaii and I ended up going to school at BYU Hawaii. I currently teach at this institution. But at the time, I didn't realize it, but that there was a 4-year liberal arts university on the North Shore of Oahu. And it was cheap tuition. In fact, I pretty much got school for free. And I mean, after my dad passed away, I was sort of on my own financially. So I ended up coming back to school here and just having the fortune of spending a lot of time surfing here in Hawaii on the North Shore and on the east side of Oahu. So long story short, it wasn't just a shift in kind of religious perspective, but it was also a shift in career perspective. So my new emphasis was on education. And I think a lot of this because, I think within that culture, that education and kind of pursuing higher education is encouraged. And so as I studied at the university, and then I finished in my undergraduate work, and I went on to graduate school in Santa Barbara, where I got a PhD at UC Santa Barbara. And it just became this kind of a sacrifice of shifting, like, okay, well, I'm really going to pursue academics. But fortunately for me, I feel like my dream of having surfing as a profession ended up coming full circle in the end when I started to do a lot of research on Hawaii. And I was very fortunate to have a cool advisor named Paul Spickard, who didn't laugh when I said I'd like to do a dissertation on the history of surfing. Everyone else laughed at me. Most of the history of surfing that has been done is more like almanac type stuff, or surf films, or just not like real critical historical perspective for like a dissertation. And so when I ended up doing that, and I found that there's so many cool stories that where Hawaiian history and surfing overlap, and then I decided, like, I want to tell the story of Hawaii and its history through surfing as the lens to tell that story. And then maybe I'll be able to attract an audience that I'm kind of tricking, right? So like, I'm going to pick up this surf history book, and then you put it down and you're like, whoa, I just learned a lot about Hawaii. And so that became kind of the emphasis. And so it's really cool because what's happened in the long run is that it opened up a lot of doors for me to still be able to make surfing my career, and give lectures around the world, to being in various documentary films, to even one of my funnest is commentating once in a while at events like the Backdoor Shootout and stuff. So it's been my world turned upside down when I was 16, but in the end, my life turned out to be a lot cooler, I think, in many ways, by taking a different route. So I'm so stoked because in many ways, had I even tried to pursue professional surfing, I maybe it would lasted less than a year, but my career is really still young at this point. And I'm able to, make a living off of it and enjoy talking and teaching about Hawaii and surfing.
Oh, so great.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story, especially about your dad. Anyone who has faced the loss of a parent, I'm sure, can feel the weight of that never quite leaves one's body. You dedicated your book, Waves of Resistance, to your dad, Murray.
Ooh, perceptive.
and you wrote that he taught you to care about people and their stories. And I'm interested to know how he modeled that for you.
Oh, wow. I wish my students were as vigilant of reading the fine print as you.
I've had a few extra years of experience.
Yeah, so my dad was originally from Ohio and also Kentucky, and he came to Hawaii. He was like a hippie doctor. So in fact, he was like, my life story is based on the fact that he didn't want to cut his long hair. So he had like a residency with University of Chicago. So he was a doctor, and he was, young, out of medical school. And they said, sure, yeah, we'd love to have you. Just, you got to cut that long hair of yours and then you can come join us. And he sort of, flipped the bird to the system and found Queen's Hospital in Honolulu, and, a pretty liberal state. And they were happy to take him with his hair long. And so he came to Hawaii, met my mom. My mom grew up in Hawaii, and my grandmother, as I said earlier, was originally from Oahu and Waikiki. And so, they met, and then they ended up moving to Hilo, because he was able to, he reached out to underserved communities. So that was sort of his MO, right? So we moved to Hilo on the Big Island, and I was born in Hilo. Actually, my parents had my older two sisters, and they moved there, and then I was born there. And so he served like this community in ways that inspired me. Like, I remember as a little kid going to old tutus' houses, like old aunties and grandmas in Hilo who were sick, and he would make house calls, and I would tag along and sit in the living room and eat cookies and talk to old Hawaiian ladies while my dad would do these house visits. And oftentimes, these individuals didn't have insurance or much money to pay. And so we'd always have like a lot of fresh fruit and fish and things that would come in handy for for some sort of trade, which was great for my dad as a person. It ended up not being so great financially. After he passed, we ended up losing our house, but it still was an example to, like, for me to watch his example of caring for people in a way that he sort of gave himself, and in very selfless ways. And so for me, a lot of my research when it started was actually here on Oahu, and I was talking to people like the late Imbert Soren, for example, who was one of the founders of the surf club, the Hui o He'enalu. And he worked as a carpet layer at BYU Hawaii, where I was an undergraduate student. And growing up in Hilo, there was like a lot of like kind of, scary vibe about the Hui. And when I met this one particular guy, I was like amazed with how like cool he was. And he wasn't very threatening to me at all. In fact, I was like, I scheduled an interview to talk with him. And he was the first person I interviewed that led to this larger project. And what blew me away was just that the stories that I had been sort of, I don't want to say brainwashed by, but from the media and stuff, and from newspapers and from films, like the image of what the Hawaiian surfer and the Hui was, and my experience with Imbert Soren was just a complete opposite. And this guy had so much aloha. He was giving me all kind of, he's like, oh, here, have some shirts, let me buy you lunch, and just very, very like lots of aloha. And when I heard his story, it was a story that to me wasn't being told enough. And it was about the Hawaiian experience on the North Shore that had a longer history of stories of the ocean as being like a sanctuary, a pu'uhonua, a sort of a place where a lot of these local guys could still feel significant, feel a connection and an identity with their culture, but also space that they feel like they had some sort of control in. Whereas on land, a lot of, men that age and Hawaiians, weren't really valued in the sense of like the Western notions of authority. A lot of them maybe didn't graduate from school or didn't have high paying jobs and didn't own fancy homes, but in the ocean, they still could feel important. And, that started me to just do a lot of oral interviews, and brings me back to like thoughts of my dad and the time that he spent in people's homes and just caring about their voice. And so really this book is about providing a voice for those whose voice hasn't been heard. And that's where it all kind of started. And then it, got me into kind of exploring some of these themes of what is a pu'uhonu, or kind of sanctuary, and how is the ocean a kind of sanctuary for people in different ways. In academic fields, there's a field of study called borderlands theory, and it's about looking at spaces where hierarchies are flipped upside down and it's not the norm. Because we oftentimes we simplify history by telling a story of winners and losers, but we don't look at the nuances of pockets of hierarchies being turned upside down. And to me, the ocean was completely that story. And also from lived experience too, growing up in Hawaii, seeing who the hierarchy was in the surf, in the waves, was very different than on land. And it's always intrigued me how that plays out, especially for Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiians.
Sorry to interrupt the conversation, but we wanted to take a moment to recognize the generous folks who have supported us this season. The Water People podcast is brought to you by the fine folks at Sanuk. In 1997, founder Jeff Kelly started out with one simple goal: to make people smile, and to encourage them to pass it on. Sanuk has been advocating for a more playful and inclusive surfing culture for more than 2 decades, while crafting some of the comfiest footwear around. Thanks, Sanuk, for your support and for encouraging water people around the globe to protect their happy places. Learn more about Sanuk's partnership with the Surfrider Foundation at sanuk.com.
Thanks to Gary McNeil Concepts, who put together cosmic boards for cosmic people. Gaz's boards combine recycled and plant-based materials that are built to last without sacrificing performance. To learn more, head to garymcneilconcepts.com. Oh, wow. I have about 20 directions in my mind that I want to go right now, Isaiah. I think it's really beautiful how your journey has got these loops that loop back to your childhood with your dad, where you've been able to sit with people now as you sat with people with your dad. And that inspires me as a new young father with a 3-year-old boy, where I want to include him in everything we're doing whenever we're up or down the coast and meeting with friends who belong to different cultures or communities. It's something I've always wanted to include him in. So thank you for sharing that that's what your dad did with you, because it's obviously had a huge and positive impact on your life and your ability to sit with people, older generations, and have good ears for listening with them. So that's one thing out of my head that I wanted to get out of my head. But I also heard then too, you speak about like the very narrow view of winners and losers when we talk about history or even just any moment in time right now, especially with surfing, and that your experience of surfing as a young fella up until 16 or so, or until you walked away from the idea of professional surfing, was very much in that winners and losers paradigm, and I grew up the same, and Lauren pretty much grew up the same as well, even though we're on different parts of the ocean, different oceans altogether, the Atlantic and the Pacific. We still were born into a very competitive concept of what surfing is and how it fit into life. Though there's always been other branches of the surfing tree, other, expressions within surfing culture. And this is where your book has been so wonderful to read and pass on to friends here in Australia, and just hope that more and more people, as many surfers, all surfers, get the chance to read it, because it feels like we're at a moment now where these other stories are actually really longed for by the surfing organism and are being listened to and celebrated. And so anyway, I wanted to sort of zoom back to where you mentioned how hierarchies were flipped in the surfing lineup, and especially in Hawaii. We wanted to just hear from you, because it's in the book and it's very clear, but we wanted to hear from you about that space where people are riding waves, and back in the early colonization period in Hawaii, where it was kind of the last area where Hawaiians were being Hawaiian in that space, and any time the white fella would try and come in there, it was obvious that this was a Hawaiian space of absolute skill and empowerment. Just wanted to zoom in on that, because when I speak with people about your book, that's kind of one of the first things I mention is how you describe that.
Thank you. And first of all, I mean, thanks for you contributing to my perspective. I mean, just your thoughts that you just shared now about the competitive mindset and the way that we're sort of kind of channeled to think in that way, which is unfortunate, especially as a parent, you know, you're raising kids, and you see it a lot too, where even the surfing world kind of obsesses over the kind of youth culture, and like, you know, you see kids, being highlighted in videos, and there's this, you know, really heavy expectation that we put on this younger generation by doing so. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like setting up our youth to feel this sense of loss, because, like, you know, how many John Florences can there be, you know? And then, so I think that, I mean, that alone really important, because I still have that competitive side of me, not as a competitor, but as a coach. I've been coaching high school surfing for some time now, and I still sort of have that sort of, component. But as a parent of kids who surf, you know, I realize sort of sometimes the dangers of like putting your kid into that kind of a spot of being pressured into that winner or loser kind of category. And for sure, there's a lot of other expressions of surfing where you can be happy even if you're not constantly winning competitions. But to your question about hierarchies being flipped upside down, I think one of the stories that has been told, and I mean, I guess you could say overtold, is the story of Rabbit on the North Shore, right? Where he comes to North Shore and ends up telling the story of how him and Ian Carnes were sort of jumped, and that story has become larger than life. Interestingly, on a side note, and this may or may not be true, you know, when you interview people and stuff, but I interviewed one guy one time. He's like, "Oh, that story got better and better, huh?" Because like, I was the guy who punched him. I don't know why he had choke people and jump him. It was just me. So anyway, so I mean, I don't know the authenticity of that, but it is interesting how. But one thing I do appreciate about Rabbit and his retelling of that story many times over is he does have the message right of this sense of that he recognized later that why the Hawaiians were so upset, that it was this sort of last vestige of culture. I'd hate to say that it was the last vestige. I mean, we don't want to say that, because granted, there were a lot of forms of Hawaiian culture that did experience some suppression, but we also see a revitalization, for example, in Hawaiian language and hula, Hawaiian music, and many of these different cultural components, cultural, expressions in Hawaiian society that did struggle early on, found their way back. And so, but for sure, the experience in the ocean for Hawaiians, it's gone through many different phases of Hawaiians having to assert their presence in that space. One of the first ones is the story of where in Waikiki, where we have the famous promoter of tourism and a booster of surfing known as Alexander Hume Ford. And he essentially, comes from the United States to Hawaii and starts to write and, publishes different things about surfing, and it becomes a tool for marketing Hawaii as a place to come and visit. He's also known as the founder of the Outrigger Club that was originally a segregated club for whites only. And interestingly, the same individuals who overthrew or staged a coup against the Kingdom of Hawaii end up becoming a part of this surf club. But when I saw that, it blew my mind. So essentially, the way I found that was I went to the Outrigger Club has an archives. And although I'm Hawaiian, I'm a white Hawaiian, right? So which gave me some privilege and access. So I just went there and I was like, hey, I was wondering if I could take a look at some of your, archival documents. I'm looking for some early times of when the full club was formed. And so they were nice enough to give me copies of some of the documents of when the club first started. And right off the bat, names like Sanford Dole and Lauren Thurston and all these individuals who were adamant about getting rid of the Hawaiian Kingdom government, and in their writings very paternalistic and racist about the way that they would write about Hawaiians as being inferior and savage and so forth. So to find them now in charge of this surf club in Waikiki blew my mind. And this is taking place like within a few years after the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So it's very fresh. And then on the other side, as I was researching into, there's this other club called the Hui Nalu Club, not to be mistaken with the Hui o He'e Nalu. These are just similar words. A hui is a group or a club, and Nalu is a wave. He'e Nalu is wave sliding. So anyway, so the Hui Nalu Club was this club that Duke Kahanamoku and a bunch of his friends and fellow surfers in Waikiki, theirs wasn't racially segregated. There were some white guys in their club. So you could be of any ethnicity and be a part of the Hui Nalu Club, but it was a predominantly Hawaiian club. So this is where we find them really having to assert themselves to maintain this space as theirs when you have this same group that was involved with overturning their government on land. It's now making their way into the surf with the same kinds of baggage and rhetoric of race and racism, and using that in their club. And the outcome, as I mentioned before, was very different than what happened on land. In the ocean, these Huinalu surfers were able to basically maintain their dominance and their space in the lineup. Duke Kahanamoku has been the ambassador of aloha. A lot of that, to be honest, he was aloha for sure. But I think the tourism industry has really marketed heavily on him as only like an ambassador of aloha and not a warrior, right? There's stories of Duke, his younger brother, right? There's this oral history that I found, and his brother was talking about Duke. He says, Duke was a nice guy, but brother had heavy hands. So he said, like,
big hands.
He's a big guy. I mean, they said that his swimming was incredible because he had such large hands and feet. He was tall, he was strong. And eventually you have these other Waikiki Beach Boys with names like Ox and Steamboat, and like that are reflective of a very kind of a powerful presence. Whereas tourism really was trying to market the islands as a safe and inviting and a peaceful place. And so there was no space for the Hawaiian warrior kind of image in that marketing. And so Duke has in many ways been, the poster child of the tourism industry by being this ambassador of aloha, which he was, but he also was not a pushover. And so when it came to like holding his ground against these folks who overthrew the queen and that were now claiming that the waves belonged to them and that they weren't even allowed to step foot on their showers or in their restaurant, it didn't go over that smoothly. They really asserted themselves, and I'm guessing at least one of them had a Rabbit Bartholomew experience.
Guaranteed. Well, I know for me that part of your book, Waves of Resistance, was huge because it gave so much depth and specificity. Like it zoomed right in to the fact that those men and women who went through that experience in Waikiki, their kids were all the ones who were the parents of us and our generation and whatnot. And it was so close in time that this wasn't like a long time ago. This was just one generation back had to deal with that. And And so for me, that really enlightened me in regards to then how things were going down on the North Shore in the 70s and why that was happening, and the frustration and that feeling among the Hawaiian community there. And it was a true education for me as someone coming from the other side of the Pacific. So I really wanted to thank you for doing that and being able to uncover that and share that with people.
And to contextualize the history of the way Hawaiians have used and continue to use Kapoina Nalu as a site for contesting colonial oppression. I think we don't often use those overt terms, but I love the way you spell it out so clearly. And I'd love if you could talk us through the ways that surfing has been significant in that way for people who haven't yet encountered your book.
Yeah, thank you. Again, you're one of my favorite students already, both of you, of the book, because I could tell that you've read it. So fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I want to start to go back again to the North Shore in the 1970s. In many ways, a lot of the tensions that we see, especially in the 70s, it's just really miseducation and the lack of understanding this kind of context, as Lauren pointed out here. Like, it's so important to, contextualize events, especially like when we're talking about, like aggression that took place on the North Shore in the 1970s, and also these kind of protests against the professional events having, they had these, permits. We still do that today, but they'd have permits that gave them exclusive access to the North Shore for longer periods of time than what we have today. And so that, was seen as essentially, as I interviewed people, they would use the same language when talking about how the Queen was overthrown, and then jumping into the conversation about like how maybe the surf industry was moving into the North Shore. Same sort of language and the same, I realized that a lot of the people I was interviewing, they were maybe subconsciously making those connections just through the language that they were using when talking about both experiences. So for them, it wasn't really different. The colonialism was colonialism, whether it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago, whether it was at the Iolani Palace or whether it was at Sunset Beach. It just sort of translated into a common experience. And for the people that I interviewed for this, they really mentioned how, they didn't feel like people visiting sort of understood their situation. And I think hopefully one of the goals of my book too is for people to understand historical context to things like, especially with Hawaii, and why these kind of difference in identity came to a clash. So that's actually really crucial point too, is that surfing narratives have been telling a story that really privileges mostly California, to be honest. Like, and it's been in many ways real kind of an irresponsible historical narrative that, it starts with, surfing was a sport of kings. Now that in and of itself is inaccurate. But the reason why it's because it sounds regal, right? Like it sounds like, oh, kings surfed. And then, because what's important is to that narrative is then it somehow becomes an adopted royal sport that becomes ours, right? So, and how does that take place? In the story, it takes place, well, Duke Kahanamoku gives it to the West Coast and to America and to Australia as this gift, and which it was. But unfortunately, the way that most of the surf history narrative goes, I'd like to think it is improving, but, at least for many generations, the story would go, well, then in many ways, it becomes like Hawaii then sort of disappears after Duke sort of hands off this sport to these other places. And it's as if, the Hawaiians kind of just died off. And that's why I'm really critical about the narrative about surfing becoming extinct in Hawaii. It's one that is incredibly incorrect. It's one that is, I hear over and over and over. And what it does is it undermines this story of Hawaiian presence in that Poina Nalu, the surf zone. So you'll hear it a lot that the missionaries came and banned the sport. and then it disappeared. And then years later, thanks to Alexander Hume Ford and then Duke Kahanamoku, sometimes it seems like Duke learned to surf from him somehow, which isn't true. And then it becomes something else. And then it's no longer but important to that narrative is that surfing died. But we all know of very, very specific examples, many of them, of Hawaiians still surfing in that period when it was supposedly extinct. I mean, Duke Kahanamoku wasn't the first Hawaiian surfer to go to California. Prince Jonah Kuhio was. And that was in 1885. Not only was he surfing in Hawaii, but he was surfing on the mainland and other places. I mean, Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain, in 1860, he writes this long journal entry describing all these native surfing and how he tried to learn and he just gave up. We have stories of surfing in Hilo, just like story after story of visitors and journalists and politicians and people writing about how people were surfing during this time when it was supposedly dead. So to me, this is important that we understand that surfing never died in Hawaii. And that's important for two reasons. Number one, that Hawaiians still have that direct kind of connection to it. And number two, it doesn't sort of promote this idea that it became something else. So when in the 70s and actually even earlier in the 60s, when you start to have these migrations of surfers coming to Hawaii, of course, Greg Knoll sort of ushers in this narrative. He ironically becomes the explorer once again. So we have, even though Hawaii is the place where surfing is founded and people recognize that, when we talk about Greg Knoll coming to the North Shore, he's a discoverer. I mean, think about that. Like he discovers surfing in Hawaii, and it's kind of like, how is that possible?
And conquers. Their language was conquering it too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I once had an experience where I don't know if I blamed Greg Knoll directly for this narrative, to be honest. I was at a dinner once with a good friend of mine named Keloa Kaio Jr. And
Junior.
Okay. Yeah. So his son was an amazing surfer too. And he's a really shy Hawaiian guy, friend of mine from out here. And he was like, "Oh, bro, Isaiah, I get like tickets to go to this Quicksilver, whatever thing at Duke's restaurant. And, I don't like, I don't know if we'll say, so you like come with me or what?" I was like, yeah. And so he has tickets to sit at the main table of like Greg Knoll is there and Greg Knoll's family and all these sort of OG guys who were surfing Waimea Bay. And K-Boy, who's junior, was invited, and he sat. Our seats were right next to Greg Knoll. Greg Knoll, had quite a few beers at that point, but I couldn't believe the kind of affection that was expressed between Greg Knoll and K-Boy Jr. The whole time, Greg Knoll had his arm around him, just crying and saying, like, "I miss your dad so much. It's not talked about enough, but that guy was taking off deeper than all of us. He was crazy. We were surfing Third Reef Pipe, and he was like the one leading the charge out there. And your dad was amazing." And here I am thinking, like, how come nobody knows who he is? And a lot of it is just because that narrative sort of fits an audience, right? And so when you have that impression that surfing sort of somehow dies out in Hawaii, and then it becomes a Californian and Australian thing. And then, so what happens in the story is they come back to Hawaii, and especially it culminates in the late 60s and 70s, especially in 1976, when they started to have a world champion crowned in professional surfing. It's this clash of identities based on the question of who owns surfing. And what's bizarre is surfing, as it's transported into these other places, picks up a very Hawaiianized, sort of appropriated Hawaiianized version of culture. And you see it, I see it like when I went to UC Santa Barbara, there's a restaurant that I would eat at called the Kahuna Grill. And they sold coconut drinks with umbrellas in them, and they had old surfboards in the restaurant. And I mean, you've seen this before, right? Like this vibe of, sometimes you'll see it like, in the Roxy ads where they're wearing plastic leis, and it's this sort of California version of Hawaiian culture that's taken on a flavor of its own, which is cool in its own right, but it's different. Like, and if you listen to like the surfers at that time, they were taking on this Hawaiian identity as a way of like, you know, avoiding an American identity, or sort of going against the mainstream of American society that was, you know, into, you know, World War II after that, and just this mainstream American society that had expectations of you to play on the football team and do all these different things. So they use this sense of a Hawaiian identity to stick it to the man in America, so to speak. And you see it in the Gidget movies and so forth. You have some guy named the Kahuna, or they have like the Hawaiian carvings and the grass shacks, and they play ukuleles, and it sort of takes on that Hawaiian flavor. So you can imagine when that version of surfing in Hawaiian culture makes its way back to the North Shore, and it's sort of contingent upon the Hawaiian surfer no longer existing. And then all of a sudden you have Hawaiian surfers who are ripping. You can see how it kind of creates this dissonance. Like, wait a minute, you guys aren't supposed to still be here. And that's where that kind of a real good example of that is in 1965, when the first professional competition on the North Shore, the Duke Invitational, takes place. And, you know, the Hawaiians aren't really included in this event, but two of them show up, and it's Eddie Aikau and Ben Aipa. And they're kind of like, so what? You guys having one contest over here? We like surf. And, well, sorry, you're not on the invitation list, right? And so you know, this is 1965, and then eventually they do get in eventually, but in that first event, apparently the story is that they paddled out and surfed anyway and got the attention. And it's sort of, but I mean, to me, that's the core of this, is sort of the struggle for identity and this possession of surfing. And I think, you know, people like Rabbit who have this experience, and many, many others who come to Hawaii and don't have that sort of historical context of how, you know, surfing has been this frontier for fighting a colonial presence for a very long time, and that Hawaiians have sort of had to assert themselves in the lineup to maintain that presence. And then it kind of comes to a head when professional surfing starts up. And so that's why it was such a tumultuous time, was because Hawaiians also were undergoing a kind of renaissance of their own. The 1970s, that same year that Rabbit encounters that incident on the North Shore, and there's all those protests, that very same year, Hokulea, the Hawaiian voyaging canoe, is launched to Tahiti. A lot of people, for some reason, think Eddie was on the first voyage. He was on the second voyage, but the first voyage was alive and well. You also had a lot of, I mean, I don't want to kind of give the impression that, oh, the Hawaiians are just, they're all innocent and stuff. There was a lot of angst and like uncertainty from the Hawaiians, even in this time period. A lot of fear of loss, right? This is when people were becoming aware that, like, oh, wow, not many people speaking Hawaiian anymore. Are we going to lose our language? And then people are like, whoa, how come we didn't know about this overthrow? How come we weren't taught this in schools? And all of a sudden you're faced with like a history that you didn't really know. And you have, you know, this birth of like Hawaiian activism. And then Hawaiians, there's a lot of like, you know, frustration, a lot of, you know, energy that's coming from the Hawaiian community generally, not just in the surf area. You had some Hawaiians that went and protested the bombing of one of our major islands called Kaho'olawe. And these Hawaiians went out, camped on there, and tried to stop the military from using it as a target site. You had Hawaiians for the first time in a few years, like just really rising up to like, you know, we're gonna block this development. We don't want this new multi-million-dollar development project put here. And so this rising sort of, it was raw, right? And I think even from the Hawaiian perspective, not to, you know, try and say that, well, you know, they were just innocent victims. They were undergoing this kind of a identity rebirth as well. And so the timing in the 1970s of all of that coming together, and for the professional surfing to culminate then, and Rabbit to show up at sunset, and then it just turned into this very explosive kind of conflict of these different worldviews of trying to understand what it was to be, who really kind of owned surfing. And so colonialism has many faces, right? It's something that takes place politically, socially, culturally, many different components of colonialism. And it is interesting to me how surfing has managed to kind of have a different version of that story. And that because of it, it sort of has allowed for the space to be significant. Now, I'd like to say that the story ends well for all Hawaiians now and in the future, but Hawaiians are, and many other, I guess, indigenous groups are constantly fighting, right? You've seen it last year on Mauna Kea. We see it in bills that are being passed this year that have to do with selling native lands to businesses. It's just like, it's exhausting, to be honest. It's been a constant struggle. And I think even for Hawaiian surfers too, there's a lot of Hawaiians that are sort of frustrated that Hawaiians' nationality in the surfing world is starting to disappear. And I'm not just saying as a people, but historically in the surfing competitions, Hawaii has been seen as its own entity, as an independent nation, which is like really cool. And I don't think we think about that enough. Like, how is it that John Florence is Hawaiian in the surf contest, and Carissa Moore and those from Hawaii represent a nation? I mean, California doesn't have its own designation in the surfing world. And it's not just competitively, it's just the world recognizes Hawaii as its own distinct place. But once the Olympics were announced, it sort of starts to change the story to where there is no Hawaii identity. And then we're seeing that kind of designation of Hawaiian surfers as now kind of becoming American. And I know that's kind of a frustration that I myself, and I know several others, sort of struggle with, even a lot of the competitors. But anyway, so it has been seems like a nonstop struggle to have voice and to have that Hawaiian expression. I mean, unfortunately in Hawaii too, we're seeing, it's very difficult these days to live near the ocean unless you're very rich. When I was a kid, my neighborhood was mostly, local and Hawaiian kids, and we grew up walking distance from the beach, and that is no longer a luxury for a lot of local families. In fact, that same community I grew up in, it's called Vaiuli at the end of Keaukaha stretch down there in Hilo. Almost all of our homes that we grew up in are now converted into vacation rentals. So when I go back there to my old neighborhood, it's just weird to see like all of our houses are now little hotels. And so, like I said, like colonialism has different forms. The nice thing about the ocean is that it's still a place where anybody can have access to, where you don't need, money, although that seems to be changing too with our wave pool technology. But the sense of access to surf has always been one that, that it is available, but increasingly becoming more difficult for Hawaiian families, many of which have to work, 2 full-time jobs just to barely make ends meet. And living next to the ocean is becoming less and less common for local and Hawaiian people.
And that's kind of an example of the insidiousness of colonialism, not living near the beach for a culture that was born and raised on the sand and in the surf zone. You're talking about taking away fundamental ways of life in the day-to-day.
Yeah.
We had actually a couple of friends from indigenous communities around where we live here on the easternmost point of Australia, actually wanting to ask you about that, about current ways that Hawaiians have to ensure there is access to these wave zones for cultural practices, to continue culture, because it feels like, these stories are pervasive. This is what you just explained is the same thing that's happening all around where we live, and at the moment we're
on our beach.
Yeah, we're trying to stop a development right here that would inhibit local First Nations groups being able to carry out ceremony and culture that have happened here for time beyond measure. So these are things that are happening everywhere, and it's neat when we can share stories with each other where perhaps you're a little further down the road there and dealing with something like this, and you could give an insight that could help us, or vice versa. So is there anything you can speak to on that level that's been working in terms of ensuring, cultural practices and accessibility to those central areas of life is maintained? Got anything there to share?
Yeah, thank you. A few things. In Hawaii, we are fortunate in that the laws here are pretty clear about not owning the beach. So I know there's some places like they'll have gated communities and they'll close off the beach and claim like that they have exclusive rights to using that beach. In Hawaii, we are fortunate currently that that's not something that can happen unless, there are a couple exceptions. One of them is like in Kaneohe, the Marine Corps base, where the Army or the military owns that stretch. But otherwise, you have to grant access. That's why if you go to the North Shore, there's access points to the beach, and it's designated every so many yards. Mm-hmm. So like you'll see, even there'll be a sign on it with like a number on it, says this is access point number 21 or whatever. So, legislative wise, it'd be good to be able to put those kind of things in place where you can, insist access. In Hawaii too, as Native Hawaiians, we do have certain additional access rights when it comes to ceremony and things like that. So that is an additional piece of legislation that, hopefully you could see in Australia as well, as of recognizing the significance, whether it's culturally or religiously, to having access to sacred sites. And those are very important in preserving those sacred sites as well, because then, if no one points out the sacredness of a certain site, then no one will know. And next thing you know, they're bulldozing it, and then it's too late. So, through legislation, do it that way. But another thing that I've seen a lot of success with, which is a very unconventional way of doing things, is my friend Brother Skibbs Nels. Brother Skibbs Nels is Hawaiian from Hilo, and he just like with his own determination went to like these beach parks that he found were not being run very well, and he just picked up a rake and started cleaning the area, and eventually it sort of caught on like wildfire, and he started basically just sort of claiming Kuleana to these beaches. And Kuleana is a Hawaiian word that just means like sort of stewardship. In Western notions of land tenure, it's like, fee simple ownership. And if you don't own it, then that's, it's not yours and you have no business being there. But Brother Skibbs took a very Hawaiian view of this. It was like, well, I don't own this beach park, but I'm going to clean it. And then next thing you know, he has a team of like 20 kids who have lawnmowers and weed whackers, and they transformed. It started with one beach park, and then it ended up being like 6 or 7 beach parks. And then the next thing you know, there's a sense of ownership through Kuleana, like a sense of ownership in a more traditional sense of like, oh, my hands were in this dirt and we planted that plant there, and now I have a relationship with this aina or this land. And then that relationship connects the community and the kids and the people to that place. And he's found tremendous success, to the point where the government, the city and county and stuff has been asking him like, oh, we'd like to turn the lease of this particular beach park over to you. And because just that aloha mentality of like, you know what, I'm just going to clean this place. It is ours. And not in the sense of ours in like not yours, but inclusive hours like ours, all of ours. And I mean, it's been hugely successful. And I think, taking on that sense of stewardship, and then once you have a community that has a sense of relationship with a place that they've cared for and are taking care of, it'd be very difficult to just come and remove you when it's pretty obvious that you have a positive presence there.
Isaiah, you spoke earlier about the sort of appropriated plastic lei version of surfing. I grew up with that, seeing those Roxy ads. And I have to say that something in me related to it and wanted to be close to Hawaiian culture and tradition in some way, because even though there were weird interpretations, there was a sense of belonging conveyed through this collective sense of play that Hawaiians really gifted the Western world, wanting to or not, I guess. But last year I was researching for a book that I put out that celebrates women surfing past and present. And I included some of the ancient Hawaiian moʻolelo about some of the great Hawaiian female surfers of lore. And I felt a little bit uncomfortable about that because they weren't necessarily my stories to tell, because I'm not Hawaiian. But as a surfer, the celebratory stories of ancient Hawaiian women in particular helped me feel a sense of belonging in a modern culture where I really did feel on the periphery much of the time. To know that ancient Hawaiian women were not only surfing alongside their brothers, but were celebrated as some of the most skillful surfers helped me really understand more deeply how narrow and exclusive our modern iteration of surf culture has become. And so I was just wondering if you could share with us a couple of those stories, maybe about Kalea or Princess Kaiulani, because I think their names aren't spoken about enough.
No, yeah, thank you. And I don't personally believe you have to be native Hawaiian to appreciate the value of other human beings and to celebrate stories of different people, and particularly we're talking about Kelea and some of these native Hawaiians. So I mean that's not a bad thing. It really just boils down to a sense of how you respect that person or that story, which is very big in Hawaiian culture and in most cultures, right? The sense of mutual respect. And I think it's pretty clear if someone is using it for right reasons or for maybe their own kind of self-promotion, or that may not be genuine. But yeah, so this is a very important point that I mentioned earlier, how there's this myth that surfing was the sport of kings. It's true and false. Yeah, it was a sport of kings, but it was also the sport of queens and commoners and old people and young people and men and women. So it's basically the sport. It was a national pastime. And women in the surfing moʻolelo make up the majority of these stories. So, which is cool, because the gender roles that we see in surfing in a more modern sense, very different from the ancient times. So gender categories have, there were different gender categories in old Hawaii, but they were different. So Hawaiian women were very active in sports, in arts and in culture and in surfing. So yeah, so the stories like Kelea is a real famous story where, she's like one of the best surfers on Maui apparently, and she ends up moving to Oahu and ends up marrying this person that she isn't happy. She's kind of tricked into marrying him in some ways. And he is mourning the death of his first wife, who drowned in the ocean. And because of that, he doesn't want to spend time in the ocean because it reminds him of this tragic experience of his first wife drowning, probably while surfing. And this ends up being too difficult for Kelea to handle. She eventually decides, I can't live in Wahiawa anymore. I'm going to move down the coast, and I've got to reconnect with my roots as a surfer. And she does. She ends up spending time in Waikiki, where she goes down to the beach and she borrows some guy's board. She's like, hey, can I borrow this board? And they're like, yeah, but sister, you sure you know how to ride them or what? And they're like, you get red dirt all over your feet. And that means, you're a mountain girl. Are you sure you can handle? The waves are pretty big today. And she goes out and, the story goes that she paddles way out to like the outer reefs there. And it was a big day apparently in Waikiki, and was riding these massive waves across the bay. And everybody started to like cheer her on, and everybody was just sort of amazed by her skill. And eventually the chief of Waikiki, who actually met her years earlier, he was the one that brought her from Maui. And he always sort of had a crush on her from that time. But anyway, he sees her, he recognizes her, and he says, hey, where are you going after this? It's like, oh, I don't know. I think I'm going back home, Maui. He's like, you like Waikiki or what? She's like, it's pretty here. And so he basically convinces her to live with him, and they end up, getting married and spending their lives together. But the standout of this story is that he's in love with her attributes as a person. It doesn't mention at all the fact that, women back then surfed with no clothing on. The emphasis wasn't on her body. Her beauty and his attraction to her was on, first of all, earlier in the story, it talks about how very smart she was at navigating the ocean with using star navigation. And he was very impressed by that. Also, like, she was witty, she seemed really smart, and she was a talented surfer. All those attributes are what in the story it emphasizes as components of her beauty. Not once does it really mention her physical body.
For me, that story speaks to me as a modern surfer, because surfing was her true north. I mean, surfing is what led her back to herself, and staying true to her relationship with surfing allowed her to continue becoming more of herself. So yeah, it transcends time and space and culture, that story.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's also a lot of moʻolelo, or stories, histories of women being, very powerful in the water too. Not just powerful as like surfing skill, but just dominant as a presence, even sort of enforcing their agenda on some men in the surf. So, gosh, there's one story of this sorceress who lives on Kauai, and she ends up drowning these surfers because they refuse to marry these girls that she hung around with. So she wanted to hand off these young women surfers to these other surfers on the island. And they all initially promised like, oh yeah, we'll take care of them. But one by one, they sort of shirked their responsibility with each of these women. And she comes back and she's pissed. And she's like, you know what, boys, we have a surf contest right now. And they're like, okay, what are we doing here? She's like, whoever catches the biggest wave and whoever survives. And they're like, okay, are we betting anything? She's like, yeah, your bones. So she basically tells them this is a life or death thing. And we're essentially, we're betting on this event here for our lives. She goes out, paddles out, and with her kind of magical powers, and she takes this vine called the pohuehue vine, and she starts whipping the water with it, and she starts saying this chant and this prayer. And the next thing you know, there's like massive waves. And she ends up riding the wave and watching as her fellow competitors literally are buried under this massive giant wave. And the story goes that they're all like, they become stones underwater. Like probably when you surf, you're like, you see all the different reef heads that you're surfing at. And it's like, okay, those are the different reef heads of the story of these guys who didn't fulfill their kuleana. They promised to take care of these women and they didn't. And this woman came out and like basically showed them what's up. So it's interesting how women's presence, very strong presence, and especially within surfing, they're really celebrated in our ancient stories of surfing and women. And yeah, kind of cool. It's kind of cool to see surfing. I mean, it's not quite there yet, but we are seeing a little bit better portrayals of women, I think, in their presence in the lineup and in the surf world. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love those stories because they're such a potent reminder that surf culture hasn't always been the way that it is now. It has come from a more inclusive lineage. And that I really wanted to reference the fact that the history of Hawaii determined the history of surfing as we know it. And even though we know surfers existed all over the world in their old and ancient histories of surfing in Africa, along the rivers of China, in South America, and other Polynesian islands, but in Hawaii, the path was laid for a robust and blossoming culture of surfing. And that really speaks to the brilliance, I think, of Hawaiians' ability to create food security, which allowed for leisure time. And so I'd love if you could address the sustainable food science of Ahupua'a and how it relates to surfing culture.
Oh, great. Yeah. So in any historical civilization, whenever there's expression of arts, it's a sign of affluence. It's a sign that that community is doing well. I don't mean affluence in the sense of kind of the capitalistic nature of the word, but in the sense of like things are going well. There's an abundance of enough for everyone, right? So, I mean, look at like ancient Athens, for example. There was a time period when they were kind of dominant. They controlled what was called the Delian League, where they had control over the treasury of all of this Greek area. And because of it, they were able to like go pretty crazy on like building, you know, all these fantastic architectural buildings and sculpture and art and all these kinds of things. Even if you look in our society today, you know, ever since sort of the recession that took place, you know, a decade or so ago, you've seen the first thing to go that gets cut in a lot of these school programs is the arts, right? So the arts is kind of a reflection of the health of a community. And the arts in ancient Hawaii were very vibrant. And, you know, we talk about surfing and, you know, it's not necessarily that you have people that try and argue like, well, where was the first surfer from? I mean, that's not really a goal of mine to prove. It's more so that in Hawaii, it was vibrant. I mean, I'm sure there were people all over the world who had figured out that, hey, my canoe, if you point it this way, will actually ride the wave. Or, hey, this little piece of wood that I have here can, you know, ride this wave. But in Hawaii, the surfing was developed in ways that it became, you know, very specialized in the same ways that it is today, right? So erroneously, sometimes people refer to the Hawaiian surfboard as the alaia or the alaia. That was just one. That's like saying, oh, the fish, right? Well, we have other boards too, right? Like, so there are many different types of boards for different kind of waves and even there were ways of riding waves that we haven't even explored today. One of the craziest ones was they would ride waves that would detonate on a cliff, right? So, and maybe I've seen recently Italo, where he's like standing on this big cliff and the wave hits the wall and there's this big backwash and then they're like jumping into the wave. Well, Hawaiians, one of their favorite things to do is to ride the wave into the cliff. And then as it would explode onto the cliff, the goal was to like ride up the cliff and then land on the top of it standing like a gymnast would dismount onto something.
Wow.
I think that happens here in some slabs in Australia. That happens to us, but it is totally unintentional. we don't want to do that, and we'll never want to do it again. So I get where you're coming from. That is heavy. That is heavy skill. That is real skill. Wow. What I'm trying to say here is that there were so many different ways of riding waves because it had become so entrenched from, you know, paddling into deep ocean waves to riding small waves to boogie board like boards to hand sized boards to all kind of different boards. And so it was just
a part of the society. But it wasn't just surfing. And to your point, Lauren, this was enabled by this very sustainable system called the Ahupua'a. So it's basically an oversized hydroponics system. So you see the hydroponic system, how it works. You've got the fish that kind of fertilize the water, and the water sort of pumps around in the cycle and it feeds the plants and stuff. Imagine that on the scale of like a mile or two long, right? So you have these rivers where everything was based along that water. And in Hawaiian, freshwater, the word for freshwater is vai. And the word for wealth in Hawaiian is vai, which is like a lot of water. Water is life, and it's in wealth. And so the water would then be diverted into these different taro patches and different mala or gardens. And then they'd make their way down to the end of the stream where they would have these large local i'a. Local i'a are basically these fish ponds. And that system of implementing the fish into the agriculture, and it was such a productive system that it allowed for a lot of extra leisure time, as you were suggesting earlier. And it really helped the Hawaiians develop arts. I mean, not only was it in surfing, but in a lot of other games. They had a whole season designated called Makahihi, which was in the winter months, by the way, which I'm convinced they picked the winter months because maybe the surf was bigger during those months. But that was when they had all their events. Like they'd have competitive surfing events. They had a lot of other kind of sporting events, to, a lot of like fighting events, boxing, wrestling. They had a martial arts known as the lua. And they said that women were often involved in some of these wrestling and fighting matches as well. So it was like a big kind of component of society is the arts and sports. And as you mentioned, a lot of that has to do with the sustainable system called the Ahupua'a system that was able to feed so many people and, enabled them to have all this free time.
In terms of that dichotomy of sport versus art for ancient Hawaiians, wasn't it both and more? Wasn't it experiential spirituality, and it was sometimes competitive sport, and it was relational and communal, and I feel like it's a real example of how young and in some ways narrow-minded our culture has been to say that it can only be one or the other. And obviously it's our call as adult human beings to be able to hold paradox, to be able to understand that any one experience can mean many things over the course of a day, and of course over the course of a lifetime.
For sure. Yeah. I agree with you there. And I like your emphasis. I didn't realize that was a real agenda of yours, is to show the many faces of surfing and all the other kinds of opportunities that exist for that expression. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it shouldn't be just this either or kind of a dichotomy, but it can be like, more inclusive and more holistic and more diverse, and to celebrate various forms of those kinds of expressions of surfing, for sure.
Well, definitely aware of the timeline for you, Isaiah, but I really wanted to make sure that we get this thing into as many people's hands as possible. And with this thing, I mean your book. I'm holding your book for people who are listening. Is there a way that people can get a hold of Waves of Resistance if we are in Australia, America, Europe, wherever people are listening? Because I feel like it's super important for us to do that.
Where's the most helpful place for people to buy to support you and your research and your work?
Oh, wow. Thank you for that. When you publish books in academia, I'm not really making a living directly off of the book. Indirectly, yes, because it did help my quest for tenure at my university, which comes with, rank advancement and things like that. So honestly, you can get the book anywhere it's easiest for you. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it directly from the publisher if you want, at University of Hawaii Press. I mean, you can find Kindle versions online. if you find a free version somewhere in a library, go for it. I mean, so here's a special promotion here for your podcast. If you buy the book and you want me to sign it, sorry, it sounds sort of narcissistic of me, but maybe some of your listeners are into that. Send it to me. You send me an email. It's easy to find people these days online, and I'll, whatever. I'll sign it if you want, or look me up if you're in the area, and
Great.
Anyway, so
lovely.
Yeah.
Well,
I have one last question. Actually, I have a lot more questions, but I'm only gonna give you one. As surfers who travel to Hawaii, and as part of a culture, surf culture that has historically taken so much from Hawaii and Hawaiian people, how do you see pathways to reconciliation? What do they look like to you? How can we walk more lightly and more generously as surfers wanting to do better than we've done in the past?
I think a lot of it boils down to just common sense, and more so swallowing of pride. Unfortunately, the North Shore is literally called the proving grounds, right? So when people come to Hawaii, they have this mentality of, I got to go prove myself. I'm going to put myself in the pit, or I'm going to catch the best wave of the winter, or, and it really, I think in many ways that can taint your perspective and your attitude of how to approach surfing. Come to Hawaii and don't just paddle around every uncle, or go straight out to the lineup and want to get deepest in the peak. Take your time to sit on the shoulder, to watch, and to meet people, right? Just be like, that was a good one, bro. That barrel was mean. Guarantee, if you want to get on a good side of an uncle, compliment him on one of his waves. Uncle. Uncle, that was mean. That was a good turn, or something like that. And then you'll see maybe a frowny face turn into a smile. And then next thing you know, they're like, oh boy, go, your turn. You know what I mean? So, it's just really being respectful human being. I'm always surprised at the kind of things that humans do in a lineup that you would never do. Like for example, if you're in Costco and you're in line, or at a supermarket or whatever, you wouldn't just cut in front of someone in line and just take their spot. So just be, mindful of how you're being and how you're treating other people, and, talk to people, right, with respect, and don't come to conquer or to make a name for yourself, but just come to sort of, learn something and to have an appreciation for the place, because it's beautiful, right? Hawaii is a beautiful place, and you want to feel that mana when you come here. And I think sometimes if you're so kind of caught up with, drama of a lineup, or trying to get waves and be really aggressive, then you miss sort of the experience of the place. You can, in my opinion, you can get as much pleasure watching a wave and just sort of experiencing it by watching it than just always having to catch the next wave and the best wave and another wave and another wave. So yeah, and take the time, what you guys are saying. You went to Bishop Museum, you take the time to learn about these stories, because then it means so much more to you when you're there, right? Oh wow, did you know this place Paumalu was Sunset Beach has an old name, and there's this story of this guy Kahikilani who used to surf here, and wow. And then all of a sudden it's more than just a wave. It's like a window into the past, and you can appreciate in a much deeper level the significance of that place. When it's a storied place, then you feel like much more connection to it, and it'll last with you much longer than if you're just like, oh, the waves are blown out today, or appreciate.
Thanks to Isaiah for his important contributions to writing the narrative of surf culture. Special thanks always to our sound engineer and in-house musician Shannon Soul Carroll. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my partner in rhyme, Dave Restovich, thanks for making the time to listen with us. If you have a spare moment, please consider leaving a review of the podcast or sharing an episode with a friend. Both help us find the very best stories from our global community of water people. We'll be continuing today's conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast. You can find every episode and some extras on our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com.